Hi, and welcome to another segment of This Week in Fake News. I'm your host, Candice Malcolm, the founder of True North, as well as a columnist with Post Media and the Toronto Sun. So I've got a lot to get to this week, so let's get right to it. The first story that I want to talk about was actually from last week, but I didn't get to cover it. So I want to take you back to a story that first came up through Reddit, and then it was reported on by BlogTO, and then from there it sort of trickled to the rest of the mainstream media. And the story that I'm talking about is of a woman who was in Nathan Phillips Square in downtown Toronto with a sign that said, "Vote Andrew Scheer." Now, this woman was screaming profanities. She was being racist and shouting sort of despicable things at people who walk by. Someone caught her on tape, and that is how the story got to the news. So, of course, the headlines were all about how an Andrew Scheer supporter was caught on camera shouting racial slurs, and everyone just ran with it. Nobody bothered to do any due diligence about the very basic facts of the story. And so as soon as some independent journalists started digging into this story, very quickly the whole thing just started to unravel. The very first point that no one in the media bothered to report on was the fact that the person who filmed this video and uploaded it online and then spread it to the mainstream media was actually a Liberal staffer. This was a person who used to work for Bill Morneau. So first things first, we have a Liberal staffer meddling in the creation of news. That should be a huge red flag to anyone in a newsroom, but instead they just ran with it. Now, instead of sort of reporting on who this woman was and maybe doing a bit of digging into her background, they just assumed that, well, she's holding an Andrew Scheer sign, so she must be a conservative, right? I mean, to any conservative or anyone who's just looking at this story with a sort of balanced mind would just assume it's a hoax. It doesn't really seem like something that a sane person would do or that a normal conservative activist would do. It's sort of like a caricature of what the far left believes the right to be like, but it's not actually what the conservative right is like in Canada. So we do a bit of digging, and of course it turns out to be an obvious hoax. The woman herself is a left-wing activist. She is a writer in Toronto, and up until very recently, she kind of held the very paint-by-numbers left-wing views about immigration, open borders, diversity, blah, 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 blah. Even her own brother posted online saying that this was probably a hoax because she's a Liberal supporter and she just wanted to make conservatives look bad. The story gets even deeper. We learned that the woman was actually taken into CAMH, which is a mental health facility in Toronto. So she's suffering from some kind of a mental health outbreak. She's out of her mind, and the media just ignored all that and ran to report with it. It's kind of funny when there's a terrorist attack, especially when there is a Islamist terrorist attack, the media tell everyone to be super cautious. They warn people not to jump to conclusions, and they always try to play the mental health card. Except for when it's a conservative who is the center of the story. They don't take any time to wait. They don't do any fact checking. They don't do any digging. They just jump to embarrass conservatives. So that is the mainstream media in a nutshell. I got 3 more stories I want to get through in this episode, so let's move on to the next one. Everyone has been talking about this video this week of Andrew Scheer. This is a video from 2005 when Andrew Scheer was giving a speech in the House of Commons opposing gay marriage. Now, a lot of conservatives sent this story to me because they think it's unfair that the media is kind of has unearthed this video and that Liberal activists are using it to discredit Andrew Scheer. And the point that they make, which is a fair, valid point, I think, which was that back in 2005, a lot of Liberal MPs themselves voted against the gay marriage equality bill that was being presented in the House. A lot of mainstream Liberals in both Canada and the US at the time opposed gay marriage, including people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton at the time. So Scheer was sort of, I guess, in line with like the mainstream thinking at the time. I disagree. I don't like this video. I kind of cringe when I watch it, and I think Scheer is wrong. I don't think he takes the right position. As a conservative, conservatives should believe that marriage is like the central institution of society, that marriage and family are the most important thing, and that should be inclusive. It should expand and include everyone. This is what I believed back in 2005 and obviously still believe it now. So trying to exclude people from marriage isn't the right way to look at things. Like, liberals believe that the government is the central institution in society, so if there's ever a problem, it's the government that should solve it, whereas conservatives should and do believe that it's families that are the central institution in society, and that when there's a problem, it should be first and foremost solved by individuals, families, and communities. So we should support that institution and promote it and include everyone. So when I see Scheer's comments, I cringe. I think he was wrong. And I think it's totally fair game to criticize Scheer and the conservatives on this video, just like I believe it's fair game to criticize Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, for old videos that surface of him saying horrible anti-Canadian things, like that he would want to separate from Canada if Albertans were in charge, or that he thinks that he admires China because it's a absolute dictatorship. I don't think that there's a statute of limitation on videos and saying stupid things. So that's not what I'm going to cover. I think it is fair game, although I think it's also important to point out that people like Ralph Goodale, who's spreading this video and trying to make the conservatives look bad, just remember that in 2005, Ralph Goodale also voted against the Gay Marriage Equality Act. Now, let's move on. This one I found to be absolutely hilarious and kind of just a whole, in a nutshell, the problem with the Canadian media. So right now, everyone's interested in fact-checking. The CBC and the Liberals are all over the idea that there's fake news and disinformation online, and they want to be the ones that are jumping out in front and stopping that and exposing it and dispelling these myths and blah, blah, blah. We all know that what they're talking about, though, is not so-called fake news. It's just conservative opinions, conservative ideas, and even conservative news. So a good example of this was that Adam Vaughan, the Liberal MP from downtown Toronto, posted a couple of tweets that were just absolutely abhorrent. He said that on the day our government restores funding for refugee legal services cut by conservatives, the Ontario PCs come out after the children of refugees. Absolutely shameful. We all know where radical conservative agendas lead. And then he has this picture of children behind fences at what is clearly a U.S. detention center on the southern U.S.-Mexico border. So how does it possibly have anything to do with conservatives in Canada to show Central American families being detained for illegally entering the United States? Like, there's no connection there, and it's pretty obvious. So he sent out this tweet. He sent out another tweet sort of implying that the conservatives were going to put children in cages, and everyone was all over him for these basically just completely false statements and kind of fear-mongering, like saying that somehow conservatives in Canada were going to put children into cages. And then all of a sudden, this woman who is a verified account from the CBC, she chimes in and she says, "This looks pretty clear to me that he's talking about the US. What about this tweet makes you think he's trying to say the image is from Canada?" And so you click on this lady's account, and her title is Senior Reporter Covering Disinformation Online at CBC News. So her job is to be a disinformation officer and go online and sort of be the self-appointed arbiter of what is true and what is not true on the internet. And she chooses to jump in and defend a Liberal MP who's clearly misleading the public. He's clearly being facetious and exaggerating and lying. Here's the other tweet. The Conservatives tried to take away health care for the children of refugees. Now they're trying to blame school cuts on these children. All children need care, and all should be in school. We all know where right-wing scapegoating leads us. Our government won't cage children. Okay, so she's saying that that's clearly about the U.S., but the whole tweet is about Canada. First of all, Republicans in the U.S. don't call themselves conservatives, big C conservatives. That's a Canadian thing. And he says right there, the Conservatives tried to take away health care for the children of refugees. He's talking about in Canada. That is a false claim, by the way. The Conservatives tried to take away healthcare coverage for people who had been rejected. So people who had tried to become refugees and been rejected. So they were bogus. They were bogus asylum seekers and not refugees. So saying that they try to take away healthcare for refugees is patently false. Where's the disinformation officer on that point? But anyway, the point is that the whole context of this tweet is Canada. He's talking about Canadians. And then this CBC disinformation officer is saying, looks pretty clear that he's talking about the US. What about this tweet makes you think he's saying the images from Canada? Well, how about that the whole tweet is about Canada and that he is a Liberal MP in Canada, so presumably he's talking about Canada. Good job, CBC. Your tax dollars at work. And, this is the funniest thing about the CBC and their so-called fact-checking. There's another story that I want to get to. I'll just go through it super quickly. Basically, there was so Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party, made a claim that, let's just see if I can find his claim here. He made a claim that that immigrants cost the Canadian taxpayer the fiscal burden of having immigration to Canada is in the neighborhood of $30 billion. So there's an annual fiscal burden for immigrants, all immigrants to Canada, that they spend $30 billion more in services than they pay in taxes. And he quotes a Fraser Institute study. So the CBC jumps all over that claim and they say that he is wrong, and they do a whole fact check. So Maxime Bernier's false claim about Canada's subsidizing immigrants. And he goes through the claim: Canadians are compassionate people, but at what cost? Are Canadians happy to subsidize 74% of our current immigrants? And so he goes through how Bernier gets that number. And it's actually pretty logical. So the People's Party founder went on to crunch some numbers of his own, noting that 55% of immigrants to Canada are economic class. And according to the latest government figure, but almost half of the people in that category were spouses and dependents. So if just over half the people coming to Canada are in the economic class, the other part are either family reunification or refugees. And then of that economic class, it's not just the breadwinner, it's not just the person getting the visa, it's also their family, so wives or spouses and children. So he said that it's only 26% of the total number that are the economic class, and so that would lead 74% that were somehow not contributing economically, but that were part of the kind of subsidized. And so then the CBC goes on this long rant, their fact checker, and he just really starts talking about a bunch of irrelevant facts. Like he's talking about how immigrant wages are rising, that they're higher than they were a few years ago, that that a lot of times people who come to the country as children eventually end up working, getting a job, so they shouldn't be considered to just be collecting and not contributing, blah, blah, blah. He comes up with the idea that the verdict is false. And then interestingly, the people from the Fraser Institute who wrote the original report that Bernier was quoting did their own report and just completely obliterated this CBC fact check by basically saying that, the guy makes some points, but they're not relevant. If you're going to fact check the politician, just stick to the claim that he made instead of writing about all this other stuff that immigrants contribute to the economy, which obviously it's true. Obviously immigrants do contribute, but this is on a net basis. So we're looking at all the immigrants in society. So here from the Fraser Institute, authors in the Financial Post today said, according to government statistics, in 2010, the number of recent immigrants since 1985 was about 3.7 million. Now multiply this number by 5,300, and that is the number that they found that immigrants outnumbered in the benefits they received minus the taxes that they paid, and you get the fiscal burden to be 20 billion. Since then, the stock of immigrants has been increased by 250 a year. So since from 2010 to 2018, there's another 10 billion. So that's how they get over 30 billion. So really, if you're going to fact check a politician, you might want to get your numbers straight. But there's this whole, journalists are in the business of promoting the liberal talking points, especially over at the CBC. You see this time and time again. Reminded me of a story from last summer where a former Liberal cabinet minister, Seamus O'Regan, tweeted that immigrants are better at creating new businesses and new jobs than Canadian-born people, period. Simple, period. He stated matter-of-factly. And then he posted a link to a story from the CBC with this very misleading headline that said, "At creating new businesses, immigrants outpace Canadian-born people, stats can finds." And so O'Regan just clearly read that headline, and he came to the conclusion that immigrants are better at creating new businesses than Canadian-born people. The problem is that if you look at the report that the CBC is quoting, the finding was actually the exact opposite. The headline was exactly the opposite of what the finding from the paper. So the study looked at data from immigrants who came to Canada between 1980 and 2010, and they chose to measure immigrant job creation based on the number of jobs they had created after 9 years in Canada. So just before I go any further, there's a lot of compelling data. There's lots of contradictory data. The Canadian government doesn't just simply track, like, an immigrant comes to Canada, how much do they spend, how much do they receive, how much do they pay in taxes. They don't make it that clearly. So you have to kind of go out and find your own data, and there's so many different ways that you can look at it. There's so many different ways you can analyze it that it's easy to come up with contradicting points. So it really just depends on what you look at. But here, the way that they chose was after 9 years, how many jobs had they created. So that's like a very small snapshot that doesn't really cover the whole picture, but that's what they chose to look at. And so what they found was that 5.3% of immigrants owned a business, and they compared that to just 4.8% of all Canadians. So they found that almost 20% of immigrants were self-employed, whereas 16% of Canadian-born Canadians were self-employed, and that was the conclusion. But if you just look one step deeper than that, what it finds is that only a small percentage of the immigrant-owned businesses had any employees. So even though 20% of immigrants were self-employed compared to 16% of Canadian-borns, the Canadian-born businesses tended to employ a lot more people, whereas the immigrant-owned companies tended to just be like a sole proprietorship, one worker, self-employed. And so then if you just look a little deeper, the authors found that Canadian-born businesses employed more people, on average nearly double as many as the foreign-born business owners. So in other words, the study found the exact opposite of what the CBC's own headline said, and the exact opposite of what O'Regan claimed, which is that the finding actually was that Canadian-born businesses created more jobs, both on a per capita and in total numbers. So it was just a flat-out mischaracterization. But the CBC and Liberals are in the business of promoting myths and pretending that immigration overall has this huge net benefit for Canada. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't benefits to immigration. Surely there is, but we shouldn't lie. We shouldn't exaggerate. We should have the facts in front of us and be able to have a real conversation. And the problem when you have so-called disinformation officers ruling on the side of a Liberal MP, Adam Vaughan, even though he was clearly misleading Canadians, and he actually apologized later and deleted the tweet, so he admitted that he was wrong, but the CBC still sided with him. And then you have the CBC creating a false headline and misinterpreting the data when it's pretty clear that that study showed that Canadian businesses created more jobs, and both per capita and a real number. So really, this is just an example of the CBC misleading Canadians. And one final thing I just found was really interesting. The individual who was so-called fact-checking, Maxime Bernier, they do this political fact-check on the CBC. I just kind of did like a very quick overview and search, and I couldn't find anything that showed a fact-check on Justin Trudeau. The fact-checking looked at claims made by Andrew Scheer, by Maxime Bernier, by Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP party, but they never fact-checked Justin Trudeau. The only two fact-checking articles that I could find that even mentioned Justin Trudeau were both articles that defended Justin Trudeau against what the CBC determined to be false right-wing claims. So if anyone ever sees the CBC actually fact-checking Justin Trudeau, which you'd think that would be their job, fact-checking the most powerful politician in the country, fact-checking the actual leader, not the opposition leaders who are trying to become prime minister, but fact-check the actual prime minister. If anyone finds an article of the CBC actually doing this, which should be their job, please let me know, send it on over, because I would be very interested to read it. So I'm going to leave it there for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. There's so much fake news out there. There's so much disinformation, and there's so many examples of biased Canadian journalists who know that they get funded and they get taxpayer money from the government. So they're always going to side with the Liberals. They're always going to side with Trudeau. There's tons of examples. If you see any, please send them my way so I can cover them in next week's episode. And if you like the show, if you like this channel, don't forget to subscribe, like the page, like the channel. And if you're so inclined, feel free to send a couple dollars our way. We're always trying to raise money for True North to continue providing our independent journalism. So thanks so much for tuning in, and have a great weekend.